You're listening to episode 1 of Intersections in Public Service, the Weldon Cooper Center's podcast that takes a look at some of the most pressing issues facing our community, how public servants of all kinds are trying to address them, and what you can do to help. I'm your host, Ben Fisher, and today we're going to start a multi-part series on how public servants are addressing the massive issue of affordable housing here in Central Virginia. We're going to dive into what's causing the problem, what its effects have been, what the solutions are, and how you can get involved. Across the country, low-income renter households make up a little over a quarter of the total rental population, with about 11.2 million total households. But recent studies conducted by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition showed a total of only 7.5 million rental homes available nationwide, which means there's a massive shortage of housing for low-income individuals who rent at a highly disproportionate rate. This problem is especially pronounced in Central Virginia, where the housing shortage is worse than it's been in over a decade. So, what is causing such a massive shortage? Well, according to University of Virginia Professor of Economics Ed Olsen, it can be boiled down to bad policy. So I sat down with Ed to talk about where Central Virginia governments are falling short. I want to start by first asking why you think affordable housing is so hard to come by in the United States. What are some of the causes of the so-called affordable housing crisis?
I think the main problem, it doesn't have anything to do with the workings of markets. It has to do with bad public policies, that we spend a lot of money on it, but we are not getting very much for our money.
Okay, so in terms of those public policies, what are we currently doing to try to address the issue?
Right. So, we have a number of programs to try to provide housing assistance. Most people who get low-income housing assistance are served by programs that subsidize the construction and operation of projects. And what we know from the evidence is that these programs are highly cost ineffective. They're very costly for what you get, compared with another approach that we do use, which is the housing voucher program, which provides subsidies to recipients and has them go out into the private market and find housing that meets minimum standards. And so there are these two very different ways of providing housing assistance, and we have some very good evidence about their cost effectiveness, that it costs much more to provide housing in these projects than with vouchers. Equally good housing in equally good neighborhoods. So that's I would say is one of the biggest problems. The other problem is that we don't have a system that provides housing assistance to all of the people we make eligible. We don't have an entitlement housing assistance program like the food stamp program or like Medicaid. What we do is we provide very large subsidies to a lucky minority, and we offer nothing to the majority of people who are equally poor and who are the very poorest. And I think we can do better in both of those regards.
Okay. So you believe that the current system should be changed to one in which we have a housing subsidy entitlement program?
Absolutely. I can't see any. It's a historic. The current system, the non-entitlement current system, is a historical accident. It resulted from the fact that when the federal government first became involved, it opted to subsidize the construction of public housing projects, and it made a lot of people eligible for housing assistance relative to the number of projects that could be built in any reasonable time. So we started out with a non-entitlement system, and we just have continued to do that. There's just no way you can justify providing large subsidies to some people and offering zero to other people who are in exactly the same economic circumstances. I mean, if a congressman were to get up and propose to make the subsidy in the food stamp program twice as generous and serve half the number of people chosen at random, I don't think there'd be a single vote for it. So if we rethought this, I don't think there would really be any support for the current system, that nature of the current system, and it's totally unnecessary. We had an experiment. The largest social experiment ever conducted by the federal government was the Experimental Housing Allowance Program. It was conducted in the 1970s. in the housing allowance, the largest part of the housing allowance program was the housing assistance supply experiment, which operated an entitlement housing allowance program in 2 metropolitan areas. So we actually know, and there were 300 reports that came out of this experiment. So we actually have tried it. It worked like a charm. There were no problems with it, and there is no reason why we can't do it now. We should do it now.
The experimental housing allowance program was actually one of the most important studies conducted in housing in United States history. And in the 1970s, it was used as the cornerstone for housing policy going forward. It was because of the findings of this experiment that Congress moved ahead with legislation in 1974 to create the housing allowance program that we know today as the Housing Choice Voucher program, which serves 2.2 million families. However, since the 1970s, lobbying from various groups caused this trend of moving towards allowance-based programs to reverse.
For the federal government now, do you think it might be difficult, the idea of reducing the amount of subsidies that some people who currently receive subsidies are getting? Because I think that could be an issue. Yeah. It seems like affordable housing is already difficult to come by, even for some people who are receiving subsidies.
Yeah, well, the way this would have to be achieved is to really grandfather current recipients. That's the norm in policy reform, major policy reform. Let the current recipients continue to receive the benefits they receive on the same terms until they leave the program. So no current recipients are hurt. That's what I would favor, yes.
You think that people would be receiving enough subsidies? Future people who just joined the program would be receiving sufficient subsidies at a lower rate than subsidies are currently being given out?
Certainly, if let me tell you how generous the current subsidies are to give you a sense of it.
Sure.
So in the housing voucher program, as an example, the poorest recipients get a subsidy of $1,200 a month. I don't think we need to provide, which basically enables them to occupy rental housing of about average quality, meaning half the people live in housing that is less expensive, rental housing that is less expensive. So can people spend less than $1,200 a month and get housing? They can. They can, absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense. So then what makes household-based subsidies so much more effective?
The person with a voucher has a choice among many landlords. Not all landlords will serve them, but many will. And if the landlords don't give them good housing for the money, at the end of the lease, they can move to another landlord. So the landlords have to compete for their business. In subsidized housing projects, that is not the case. You're on a waiting list, whether it's for vouchers or for public housing or for privately owned subsidized projects. But if it's for a project and you reach the top of the list, you're offered an all or nothing choice of a particular unit on a take it or leave it basis. And if you are in a project and you don't like what you're getting for your money, you can move, but not with the subsidy going with you. There are really 2 types of housing subsidized projects. There is public housing. Public housing projects are operated by local public housing authorities. These local public housing authorities, local public housing authorities, the leadership is appointed by the city government. But you can think of them as governmental agencies, even though they're not a part of the city government. The city controls the leadership. The federal government gives the money and a lot of regulations that come along with it. But the point is that public housing authorities, the people do not have the same financial incentives to make good decisions as a landlord. They have a captive audience. They have a set of people who are paying very low rents, and they can make very bad decisions about the money that they are given and still provide housing that is sufficiently good that all of those units are occupied. So I think that there are a variety of reasons, but the reason to believe it isn't my theoretical arguments. It is that there are major HUD-funded studies that are about 400 pages long, done by people at a leading contract research firm, which actually figured out what the cost is of units provided under the different programs, the housing voucher program and and different types of programs at public housing and programs that have HUD's major programs that have subsidized the construction of privately owned projects, and looked at the market rent of those units, figured out what those units would rent for in the market. And what those studies show is a massive excessive cost for public housing and for the privately owned subsidized projects compared with housing vouchers, judging what you're getting for your money by the market rent of the unit.
Okay. You said actually that the difference was so large that we could be serving 72% more people for the same cost if we switch to entirely voucher-based programs.
That is a lower bound, at least 72% more. Serving them equally well, equally good housing for the same rent.
Okay. So, but up to this point, we've been talking about essentially renter households only.
Yeah.
But you've also done work talking about homeowners and homeownership. So maybe you can talk about briefly what's the difference between renting and owning, and why that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it with respect to housing policy. So low-income housing policy is very biased towards rental programs. And the reason that is we have a bunch of individual programs. And with minor exceptions, these programs are either rental programs or they're home ownership programs. And these are not entitlement programs. Every year, Congress decides how much money to appropriate to each of these programs. And Congress has chosen to appropriate the bulk of the money for low-income housing assistance. It's like over 85% of the money for low-income housing assistance to the rental assistance programs where you have to rent in order to receive assistance. Question is, why has Congress done that? I think part of it is the following simplistic analysis. Homeowners are much wealthier than renters, and therefore if we subsidize home ownership low-income programs, we'd be subsidizing higher-income people. And it is true. I mean, the average income of homeowners is twice the average income of renters. That is true. But the point is there are very low-income renters and there are very low-income homeowners. It might surprise you to know that if you look at the poorest 10% of households in this country who receive no housing assistance at all, 25% of them are homeowners without assistance. Okay, and it is also true that when we operated those experimental housing allowance programs in the two metro areas, the ones that I mentioned earlier, those programs were housing voucher programs that were tenure neutral. They just said to each person, so they decided who's going to be eligible. Basically, it was the poorest 20%. Of course, 20% will be eligible. Anyone that comes in gets it. You know, how much you get in the subsidy does depend on your economic circumstances. The poorer you are, the more you get. But it was neutral with respect to home ownership. It said go out into the private market, find a rental unit or a unit that you're going to buy or one that you're already in. And if it meets the standards, the program's minimum standards, here's the subsidy we'll give you. There was no bias towards or against home ownership. 40% of the people in that experiment were homeowners, the people who received subsidies in that housing allowance program. So not only is it a theoretical proposition that we can do it, we know we can do it because it has already been done and studied.
So the way to benefit the most people is to provide housing vouchers for renters and for homeowners.
Correct. Make it complete. There's no reason why it can't be completely neutral with respect to home ownership. And so right now in the voucher program and most of the other programs, voucher program has a small home ownership component at the discretion of housing authorities, which has resulted in a tiny fraction of all voucher recipients receiving it. Then it's very complicated. You cut through all of that. You don't need it. You can have a very simple housing voucher program that is focused on the very poorest people and that is neutral with respect to whether you're a homeowner or not.
With that in mind, in Central Virginia, the housing crisis has been especially pronounced, and a lot of speculation has been done that this is in many ways due to the universities that exist here in Central Virginia, like James Madison, Virginia Tech, and the University of Virginia. So what role do universities play in the affordable housing issue?
Well, of course, the university has many students who have to live here to go to the university. It has a lot of employees. And so, major employer, but it counts for a large number of people who live in the Charlottesville area. And it grows over time. And that increases, and of course, if the university built housing on campus for all of the additional employees and students that it takes in, well, then it would not have any effect on the surrounding local housing market to speak of. But that typically isn't the case. There's a growth in the number of students, a growth in the faculty, well beyond any additions to housing that is provided on the campus. So that leads to higher housing demand, and especially so higher housing demand close to the university where people want to come every day. So that there's nothing unusual about that. I mean that nothing unusual about that. So so the locality, of course, the local government can offset this to some extent by changing its zoning ordinances, that is, allowing higher density, and it has already done that. I forget how long ago it was, 10 years or so ago, on 14th Street, around 14th Street, close to the university, they changed the zoning to allow all those new apartment buildings that were built there. They weren't here when I came here. They've been here certainly in the last 20 years, maybe the last 10 years. And when you do that, you increase the supply. But if to the extent that the local government doesn't do that, then as the university expands, and if it does not build additional housing for the people who come in, that's going to mean higher rents, and especially higher rents close to the university. Let's talk about public housing and what has happened with public housing over the years, and what should be happening and what is happening. So number of public housing units peaked at about a little over 1.4 million in 1991. It has been declining ever since then. It's now just a little over 1 million. So it's around 350,000 units have been less than we had before. Given what I've told you about cost and what has happened to the people who were in those units, they were given vouchers. That's what happened to them. And I've told you, based on the evidence, this is a good thing. It is a good thing that we were phasing out public housing in favor of vouchers. Well, Congress has actually done something to change that. This, from the point of view of people who run public housing authorities and operate public housing projects, it's not a good thing, because their stock is evaporating under them. So they have persuaded Congress to make some changes which will ensure that there are no fewer public housing projects than there are today. And so I think that's unfortunate.
So the truth is that in towns like Charlottesville that are desirable to live in, finding affordable housing will probably always be difficult. The key is going to be in taking action to make sure that low-income individuals have access to housing assistance. And this is where current policies are failing. Projects and unit-based policies are making it so that governments are simply unable to fulfill the needs of residents for affordable housing. Money is being spent inefficiently, providing worse housing for fewer people at higher cost. And critically, this isn't a problem that can be fixed overnight. Owners of private subsidized projects typically have legally binding agreements to provide this kind of assistance for 30 years. And while the experimental housing allowance program study Olsen mentions once informed the direction housing assistance was going in, policymakers now aren't likely to take action because they're being heavily lobbied by firms who build and run public housing projects to ensure that public housing projects won't become less common. Policy that was meant to fix the problem is now to a large extent causing it. And the effects of people not being able to find affordable housing are far-reaching.
The effects are the fact that folks don't have places to live. Number one. Number two, when I say folks, men, women, children. if you're focused on, again, that basic human need, I need shelter, and you have children, and of course these children, think about the children that have to go to school, and they need to have clothing, they need to have certain things, and so funds aren't going towards that kind of that. It's going towards trying to find a place to live, and so the effects, I mean, it trickles down. Folks living outside in the elements. Now we're talking about a health issue. Now folks are ending up in the emergency rooms.
That's Antonio Rice, the Charlottesville Salvation Army's Director of Development. He's seen the faces of the housing crisis firsthand. So I sat down with him for an interview about what the Salvation Army has been doing to help.
What we do at the Salvation Army is that we feed people. We secure, I should say, or provide the basic human needs. And so, food, shelter, clothing. And so when folks come to us, they're at the end of their rope for the most part. And they come to us in lots of different ways. So it might be, hey, our house burned down and we have no place to go. Or, gosh, that last paycheck didn't come through. Or, I can't handle the abuse anymore. And so I need a safe haven. Or, my sister kicked me off her couch and I need a place to stay. A lot of our folks have jobs. They don't make enough to, either find a place to live. And so they come to us and we provide those basic human services for them.
One of the services that you provide is emergency housing, correct?
Yes.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about this housing crisis that's been going on and what have been sort of the effects of that as you've seen?
I mean, what the effects is homelessness. I mean, people living on the streets. And so, we consider ourselves the safety net. And so, there's no reason for folks to have to live in their car or have to, so you have to really define homelessness. What does it mean? There's lots of different definitions. And so, having to live, still continue to live with your parents, to live with a relative, there's not enough affordable housing for these folks to make the kind of salary you would need to be able to afford the kind of house that you would want to live in.
One of the issues with finding emergency housing is that these standards for who is allowed to stay there aren't standardized or the same across the board. And while there are exhaustive resources available online that show where all the shelters are and what all of their standards are, online resources can sometimes be very difficult for people in need to access. But the good news is that the Salvation Army is not only one of the largest shelters here in Charlottesville, but also one of the most accepting.
And so for us at the Salvation Army, we have a 56-bed shelter. We do have some apartments, nine apartments that we have as well, and that's most certainly not enough. Now, there's a waiting list for folks to come to us, and so crisis, yeah, that's probably a good word in regards to having people having to live out of their cars and live on the street. And so again, we're there to help those folks get back on their feet. And a lot of times it's like, gosh, I need 30 days. Or I need 60 days. Let me build up my bank account so I can then put a down payment, put the first month rent down and the last month rent to be able to get back out. I mean, ultimately, we can't have people live at the Salvation Army. That's not what we're set up for. It's an emergency shelter, and so I know there's lots of partners out there, a lot of folks who are addressing this issue. And Salvation Army are the ones that kind of helps those who can't make it and who fall through the nets. We're there to catch them.
Okay, so can you walk me through what happens when somebody comes and checks into the Salvation Army?
We check them in. We make sure that they have a safe place, a warm bed, 3 square meals, and clothing. We give folks vouchers. And so typically when people show up at our shelter, I don't want to say typically, a large part, it's the clothes on their back. They don't have anything. And so we provide all of that. We provide, clothing. With Vouchers, we have a family store. And so we, which the wonderful donations we get from folks who donate items, clothing items and household items and things of that nature. And then we have a soup kitchen that provided last year close to 60,000 meals. And so that's 3 square meals. That's breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Nights of shelter provided, it was close to 20,000 nights provided in terms of shelter. And so again, it's not a place that you go to stay. It's a place that you stay to get on your feet. And so given that, we encourage folks, it's not a day shelter. So every day you have to go out and find work if you don't have a job. And if you don't have a job, we help you get one. If that's helping you, working with other nonprofits in the area, there's like over 700. We work with those folks to help people, get jobs, write resumes, whatever it might take for those folks to kind of get back on their feet and then move through our system, our processes, and then into a place of their own. Here's just a misnomer. I want you to understand, and folks listening to understand, is the fact that the folks out there holding the signs, those aren't our clients. Those aren't our guests. And so for several reasons. Now, they could be if they want to put this sign down and figure out a way to, find work. We can help you do that. But if you want to better yourself, then we're there to help you. And so what we're here for basically is to help people get back on their feet and, work themselves to self-sufficiency. And so again, we don't want people staying in our shelter. We don't. We want you out, because if you're out of our shelter, that means that you're out on your own. And so you're required every day. So you can't hang out and play video games and watch TV all day. You're required to help yourself, and we're there to lead you every step of the way. And so we like to think, we don't leave anybody behind. You come to our shelter and require our services, we're going to help you. And so that's our goal, is to just make sure that folks are moving towards self-sufficiency. Typical stay is 30 days. However, you can stay longer if you're continuing making progress. However, if you're not, then it's 30 days, because we got somebody else in the pipeline who's looking for 30 days of relief. And so that's what we're there for.
Okay. And you mentioned that the Salvation Army of Charlottesville has provided over 20,000 nights of emergency housing stay. Why do you think so many people in Charlottesville need emergency housing?
Well, I think it answers itself. And so again, a great question. I think it's because there really isn't any place to go. We are the only place in town that really kind of offers this. There's Potcham and there's the Haven. Ours is shelters are just a little different. And so I just think that explains the need that's out there, that where folks, they don't have any place to go. It's expensive to live here in Charlottesville. It takes a lot to get your own house and to maintain it and to keep it. And so therefore our numbers are just that high. I mean, it's just that simple.
Places like the Salvation Army are critical to helping those affected by the housing crisis and mitigating its terrible effects. Providing people with a stable place to live temporarily can significantly increase their ability to get back on their feet and find a new permanent home. In fact, while the housing crisis has caused a 10% increase in the total number of people checking into places like the Salvation Army, efforts by these places have caused a 30% decrease in the total number of nights that homeless people are spending in temporary housing. Rather than being stuck with nowhere to go, people are able to quickly get the support they need to find a suitable way forward. But this is only addressing one symptom of the crisis. On the next episode, we try to find the solution. But until then, thanks everybody so much for joining us on Intersections in Public Service. I really hope you enjoyed it. To hear more, you can always visit the Weldon Cooper Center on our website, coopercenter.org, on YouTube, or you can listen wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed, if you learned something, or if you felt inspired to serve your community, make sure you share this podcast with your friends, you subscribe. Thanks again, everybody, and remember, anybody can be a public servant.